Thank you, Martin. And hopefully everybody can hear me now. I'm Molly Ahern, and I'll be introducing this session, starting with a 10-minute or so summary, and then turning it over to a couple of colleagues to get further insights. So across all of the sessions over the past 2 days, we've heard about the huge potential of small fish for delivering bioavailable nutrients, essential fatty acids, and animal protein for diets, with practical examples from the latest research and interventions. However, in order for this potential to be fully realized, there's need for food systems transformation. I'm going to try to tie together a lot of the ideas presented in the last 2 days in these next 10 minutes and focus on possible policy shifts that are necessary from harvest to consumption or from bait to plate. I hope to do justice to the richness of the discussions over the past 2 days and then bring in panelists, and we'll round out the session with hopefully opening the floor with some Q&A on the way forward. And so, let me see here, I need to get to my next slide somehow. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to try to frame this session within the Sustainable Food Systems framework, focusing on the intersections between various components of the food system and the policies that shape the role of small fish within them. Many conceptualizations of food system frameworks have been developed, building upon traditional value chains approaches by addressing multiple outcomes, social, economic, and environmental, as well as drivers, scales, and levels, stakeholders and food sectors, and interactions and feedback. Food systems and their transformations are now regarded as central to the eradication of hunger and malnutrition, and the integration of systems perspectives, including social, economic, environmental, and rights-based dimensions, are particularly timely as the voluntary guidelines for food systems and nutrition were just endorsed by the World Committee on Food Security a few days ago, ahead of the UN Food System Summit later this year. Oops, sorry. So the first session looked at small fish harvesting and ecology, natural resources management, and governance frameworks affecting the harvesting of small fish. We heard about small fish accounting for a large proportion of inland catch in Africa and contributing greatly to food security and nutrition for local populations. However, catch of these small fish is often by small-scale fisheries is poorly understood, as some of these activities can be considered informal or illegal due to fisheries regulations. We also heard about the case of Peruvian Ancivetta, which was part of the Peruvian diet for thousands of years until recently. We heard about measures intended to ensure quality of Ancivetta for human consumption, actually having an adverse effect, resulting in the majority of Ancivetta catch being reduced to fish meal and fish oil. Both of these examples highlight the need to focus on scale, which I've seen coming up in the discussion in the chat quite a bit, as the majority of small-scale fisheries catches for human consumption. In addition, we saw a focus of fisheries management systems on larger fish species, often thought to be of higher value. The idea of which fish are valued and how we define value came up also several times in the discussion. Oops, here's some pictures, sorry. We also heard many presentations about processing, trade, and distribution, all parts of the food supply chain. I've circled technology, innovation, and infrastructure, as well as sociocultural and demographic drivers, and economic and market drivers, as we saw examples of these linked to the small fish value chains or supply chains. One of the main issues in small fish supply chains presented by many speakers is the preservation of quality. As we heard, some processing techniques have particularly negative impacts on nutrient retention of important micronutrients such as vitamin A, of particular public health concern, and often the focus of expensive supplementation and fortification programs. Some of the presenters over the past days have spoken about innovative technologies and infrastructure in the post-harvest fisheries sector. However, we also heard about innovative technologies that were not adopted by local communities, despite being subsidized or provided at no cost. Innovations in market infrastructure upgrading must allow for a natural evolution of desired technology based on processors and traders' existing skills, needs, and knowledge. and they must be supported by solidly funded long-term training and credit schemes. In addition, they must be sensitive to consumers and result in demand-driven end products, whether that be high-quality smoked fish, low-cost dried fish, or fish powders for child feeding, or other examples that we saw. The gender transformative approach is highly applicable when attempting to understand fisheries supply chains as well, as innovations, training, and market infrastructure should not inadvertently add to women's already overburdened schedules, working often informally, and the discussion around what informal means also came up in the post-harvest sector and in unpaid duties, but rather aim to co-develop innovations that reduce drudgery, environmental, and health concerns. So we also looked at the distribution and trade. Improved processing and storage infrastructure and technologies not only allow for extended storage life of small fish at times of plenty to be consumed in lean seasons, but also for trade and distribution to urban consumers, for use in public procurement programs such as school feeding and in emergency food rations. Although trade and distribution of small fish and value-added products offer income generation and livelihood opportunities for small-scale fisherfolk, we must also consider economic and market drivers, such as trade of small fish, which may have unintended consequences on socioeconomic development and food and nutrition security of local populations. We saw other presentations that demonstrated the importance of informal market channels and mobile vendors for fish retail and consumption, as oftentimes people do not buy small fish in formal markets such as supermarkets. Government policy and other external forces of modernization may increasingly push consumers towards formal market channels such as supermarkets, which do not offer much small fish, thus reducing people's access and eventually preferences. We also looked at consumer behavior and social norms and how they influence which species and which parts are consumed, in what ways they are consumed and by whom. So I've circled a couple more areas of this food systems framework here. We saw the case of Cambodia, where national per capita fish consumption is high, but paradoxically, so are rates of chronic malnutrition. Peering below national consumption statistics, one may see inequalities in consumption between socioeconomic classes, regions, communities, or even within households. We saw different ways that people consume small fish. There's a couple pictures to kind of exemplify some of these ways here, but this definitely does not dive into the diversity of ways that people consume and preserve small fish. With the process of globalization and urbanization, we also see shifting dietary and consumption patterns towards demand for Western foods. We saw how policies and programs aimed at improving food security and nutrition sometimes inadvertently push consumption behavior away from nutritious small fish. In addition, promotion of aquaculture should respond to consumer demand and preferences of fish. For example, promoting practices such as polyculture, which encourage farming diverse species within the pond. So in conclusion, the way forward, at least I'm going to focus on the policy section here. Through the food systems framework, we see the complex interactions and interconnectivity of various stages from bait to plate. Policymakers are encouraged to focus their efforts on promoting sustainable harvesting of small fish through appropriate management measures that inadvertently or that do not inadvertently disincentivize catch of small fish for human consumption, and focusing on scale, supporting small scale fisherfolk as they often use rather simple technology. Much of their catch is directly consumed at household level, and they play a key role in supplying local markets in often remote areas. There is a supportive global reference framework in the small scale fisheries guidelines that can help countries to include poverty alleviation and food security and nutrition in their policies and related actions. And we also must shift the way we value fish and aquatic foods. we need to value small fish as a nutritious and desirable food, not just trash or feed, as they're sometimes called trash fish or feed fish or fish meal and fish oil. We need to include food security and nutrition as policy objectives in fisheries policies and vice versa. We need to make sure that fish and aquatic foods are represented in food security and nutrition policies and food systems research. We need to foster a better understanding of the health benefits of small fish consumption and consider the implications and trade-offs of exporting small fish for fish meal and fish oil, and weigh this against the domestic needs for food security and nutrition. We also must encourage safe processing methods which preserve essential micronutrients and fatty acids and proteins in the form of demand-driven products. So looking at what consumers actually want and making sure that technology and innovations enable value chain actors to produce these products. We also saw examples of the importance of informal market channels for distribution and consumption of small fish, and the need to support these and make sure that they are not disturbed to ensure that those both near and far from water bodies have access to nutritious small fish. We need new approaches premised on different assumptions and informed by deep understanding of how fish food systems operate in particular places. With respect to interventions, they need to reflect the diversity of consumers and the range of distribution channels, supporting supply chain actors such as women and their organizations. And lastly, we need to invest in food-based approaches, such as interventions to promote small fish consumption in the first 1,000 days and school feeding through co-development of desirable products, education, and behavior change campaigns. However, to fully realize the role of small fish for food and nutrition security and its role in food systems, we need data. I heard this from many speakers that there's gaps in data from fish harvesting to processing, consumption, nutrient composition, and their contribution to socioeconomic development and food and nutrition security. This has led to the under-recognition and undervaluation of small fish for food and nutrition security. But we also need to bring all of this data together through a food systems approach, not separate data for each stage of the value chain. So I now would like to turn this over to have a discussion with some of the panelists and speakers from the different sessions. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and there we go. So I'd like to start with Jeppe and Maarten and look at what is the way forward, or I presented some possible ways forward for policy, but what is the way forward for better recognizing small fish in food systems in research? I don't know if Maarten, you want to go first?
Well, I prefer, I've been assuming that Jeppe would go first. So let's just wait for Jeppe.
Okay, thank you. Well, I was asked to sort of sum up or try to give some very brief directions on what is the future research needs. Let me just share my screen here. I hope you see it now. So the research priorities here I'm sort of covering the first step in this food chain analysis. What is the supply? And what we have to remember here, we call it from bait to plate, but actually there is a competition about this bait here. It's very basic in a way, but I mean, fish also needs food. And it sounds almost crazy to say it, but it has some, forgetting this has some serious implications. I'm going to elaborate a bit on this. The other thing we have not to forget is that this food is not plants. Fish are not really adapted as land-based animals to digest carbohydrates because carbohydrates are water soluble. So the whole food chain in the water is based on meat, protein, and fats. And to grow 1 kilo of large fish, you have to feed it 5 kilos small. Everybody in aquaculture knows that, but we forget sometimes that in fisheries. Anyway, we have this global world here, and we have a growing population, and the whole question is how are we going to feed them? And what we sort of forget is that the oceans are actually producing just as much global biological production as on land, but we only collect 2% of it. The human, I mean, only 2% of the human feed is coming from the oceans. So in principle, there is a lot of there that is unutilized. 98% of what we eat as humans come from agriculture. And here you see a picture of a good citizen who's feeding the people. And then when we go into fisheries, which only provide about 2%, then suddenly we call them buccaneers. They're overfishing and destroying the ecosystem. There is sort of an ideological gap here because they are hardly touching the surface when we compare with what's going on land. And this is, in my perspective, where we should focus our research, because if we don't recognize these things, we make a lot of mistakes, and we have made a lot of mistakes. We forget that the marine and the terrestrial environment are totally different. In many ways, when we think about fish, we think about mammals, but they are not. They breed like plants, but they feed like lions. Just imagine if a lion produced 1 million of cubs, would you want them all to grow up? How would you feed them? And this is how we think about fish without even recognizing it. We want all these small juvenile fish to grow up, but we forget how to feed them. And these fundamental differences, they have strong implications for our research. And this is where we have to change our research and also our management. So in my priorities, I think we have to move away from these, what I call the free lunch, single species concepts that we have been working on since the 1950s. What we forget there is that fish grow in mathematical models. They grow mathematically and we don't have to feed them. We have to go into multi-species and ecosystem approaches to understand the full system, because there we have to account for the food. And when we account for the food, we also have to realize that fish, they eat like lions. They need meat. They cannot digest carbohydrates. But at the same time, they breed like plants. There's millions and millions of fry normally. On land, we feed normally on the trophic level 1 and 2. We are 80% vegetarians and about 20% of our diet is proteins. So we are feeding very low in this food chain. When we go to fisheries, we mainly target trophic levels 4 and 5. And that is a highly inefficient way of utilizing the production of the sea. If we want to get more food out of the oceans, we have to move lower into the trophic levels. And that's what we see actually when we go down to the small pelagics. When we go down to the small pelagics, we are already 1 or 1.5 trophic level further down than the fish we normally target. We should also realize, and this is close to my own heart, of course, that we have undervalued the importance of inland fisheries, because they're still growing. The marine fisheries are stagnant. They could be expanded if we go lower down, but there's still a huge potential in the inland fisheries also, and they are basically forgotten in the global food discourse. At the same time, they are very much threatened, more threatened than the marine, for all these anthropogenic activities. And we have heard a lot about aquaculture, and there's this enormous idea that we can replace fisheries with aquaculture. I think we need a very, very critical approach to the role of aquaculture. For example, I think you're all aware of this article that came out after the high-level panel of experts that looked into this. And they write in terms of the role of aquaculture, they say in terms of efficiency, fish and aquaculture systems are very efficient converters of feed into protein. In fact, much more efficient than most terrestrial livestock systems. And this is a direct citation. A production of 1 kilo beef requires 61 kilo grain, 1 kilo pork or 38 kilo of grain, while fish only requires 13.5 kilo of grain. Well, I don't know where they got these figures from. They cite Stephen Hall's et al., but I mean, fish do not eat grain. They eat fish. And it takes a lot of fish to produce a large fish. So going back to the aquaculture, we have to remember that these fish are basically carnivorous. If you look at the average of aquaculture feed, then you see that 70% of the composition is protein and oil. There's very, very little carbohydrates in it. And protein and oils are the most expensive macronutrients we have. We have plenty of carbohydrates. We heard from Ghana that they eat too much there, but protein and oil is what we are missing. Even what we call herbivorous and omnivorous fish, nearly 50% of their feed is protein and oils. And that is 2.5 times more than pig and poultry. So I don't think that we can simply replace fisheries with aquaculture. We pay a high price for that in terms of feeding them. I don't know if you're aware of this article that came out in 2018, where they look at the feed conversion efficiency in aquaculture, but not just in kilo in and kilo out. They look actually at the protein and the calorie retention according to the feed. And they have looked at different cultured fish, prawn, catfish, tilapia, rainbow trout, land bison, and they have compared it with our terrestrial domesticated animals. And you can see here that for most of these aquaculture fish, they are not more efficient than cattle and pigs. So it's a dream in a way to say that fish are much more efficient. They are basically not very efficient. If we really want to do something, then chicken are much more efficient than fish. Even tilapia, which is called a low trophic level fish, has the same conversion efficiency as pigs and cattle. So in terms of research, we have to realize that we haven't moved much since we developed our first models in the 1950s. And this is what we are basing our fisheries management on today. They have developed in terms of computational. I mean, we are more statistically and things like that, but the basic conceptual development hasn't changed. We are still believing that fish are not eating. So the question is, in the future research, when we talk about small, low-cost fish, how should we then divide what is available? Should it be for people or should it be for larger fish? And I think we have to rethink the whole way we are thinking fisheries and ecology and harvesting, and have to look at it in a food system, as a food system, but also as an ecological system. We cannot just look at them as a single species stock that don't feed on each other. So thanks for that. That was my summary.
Thank you, Jeppe. Yeah, this is a really good point, that if aquaculture is going to be sustainable in the future, that we need to look at these interconnections between fisheries and aquaculture and feed. I'd like to go to Maarten now, and for your research priorities.
Okay, thank you, Molly. Thanks also, Jeppe, who also touched on all kinds of issues which you could also consider social science. My plan was to say a bit more about the social science research priorities, building, of course, on the excellent presentations which have been held in these 2 days, and which demonstrate also how good social science can actually be conducted on this topic. I take my lead from the Manifesto for the Marine Social Sciences that was drafted during the 2019 People in the Sea Conference in Amsterdam, and has since been published in the journal Maritime Studies. To start with, it's good to realize that social scientists, who belong to many disciplines, of course, they study human behavior, and we are aware that, unlike, for instance, the behavior of fish, like Jeppe was discussing, such human behavior varies greatly from context to context. And as Aristotle many years ago pointed out, social sciences can be classified more as phronetic science, in the sense that we don't normally look for universal laws, but that we always need to refer to context. So social scientists are therefore interested in variation and in change and how it actually takes place. Well, we don't know much yet about variation in the performance of small fish chains. This seminar has presented findings from a limited number of settings, and we will do a lot more research to investigate their broader relevance or broader validity. So this is actually my first message or comment to the social science community. Do more research on this topic of small fish for food and nutrition security. Why? Because it is of great societal importance and we don't know enough yet. The manifesto I just mentioned thus urges we need to pay more attention to the relationship between fish and food security and to highlight the role of small-scale fisheries, aquaculture and mariculture in promoting diversity and sustainability of fish for food. Two other remarks from this manifesto just to whet your appetite, and for those who haven't seen it yet, urge them to go and look it up. One is another point, quote, a human rights-based approach and ethical codes guiding marine social science should contribute to an improvement of the well-being of marginal and vulnerable people, including indigenous peoples. And this brings us to the ethics of scientific practice and the drive or the imperative to also take care and pay attention, especially to the most vulnerable and to their well-being. Then one last quote from this manifesto: marine social science research should bring to the fore the manifold realities of people and communities and their role in the production of knowledge and in social decision-making. Okay, these are some general statements. Let me just turn to a few more specific issues. The first one. One of the things which also came out in this conference, it has been mentioned a number of times, the interference occurring or suspected as occurring between small fish for food and small fish for reduction. And how can we avoid that small fish become too rare and too expensive for poor households to actually serve on their plates? Second one, the interference occurring between small and industrial fisheries in the supply and distribution of small fish raises a question about prioritization. Should small-scale fisheries not be prioritized, at least for stocks that are within their reach, such as is argued by the International Collective for the Support of Fish Workers? A third question, which begs further investigation. Why do certain technological innovations fail? Why don't we understand better how we can actually improve also in technologies and adapt them better to context? 4, which policies by government, market, or civil society impede the contribution of small, low-cost fish to food and nutrition security, and which help to move it forward? This begs the question, how can governance be improved, realizing that sometimes less governance is also better governance? Then, to what extent and why are local foodways, consumption habits involving small fish changing, and what are the consequences hereof? Another one before last point, how can we boost the voices of marginal players such as poor urban and rural households, women processors and traders, and small-scale fishers, so as to improve their position and their condition? And then finally, and that is a question which has been troubling me for quite some time, how to avoid that in trying to improve small and low-cost fish chains, that they will actually become outpriced and that they will turn into chains which are no longer serving low-income households, but have moved up for other in other segments of the market. These are some of the questions I think we might and should be working on as social scientists, and I look forward to further discussions, Molly.
Thank you, Maarten. Yeah, that's a great list. I hope all the researchers out there were listening and noting all of these future research questions that you identified. I'd like to now turn it to Vivek. we discussed how policymakers and the way forward with policy, and Maarten brought up in the last session that policymakers can also be part of civil society and other user groups. So what are your thoughts on the way forward for civil society, and what should they do to move things forward to recognize the role of small fish in food systems? Just a couple of minutes.
Thank you. So I was asked to look at the value chain actors and what civil society could do to them, because the value chain strictly starts from bait. So we're talking about fishing itself, and fishing, there are obviously a lot of civil society initiatives, organizations worldwide working on them, and there are many. It's a complicated area, and given that there may be larger organizations, international organizations who have their own understanding of fisheries, but many of the local civil society organizations are weak in their understanding of fisheries. And especially areas where we have large resource boundaries like India, where things are not very obvious and solutions are not immediately locally solvable. And the CSO struggle. So we find a lot of mess actually. So sometimes as it happened in the tsunami, doing no harm is much better than doing something. And so there are many pitfalls in that, but I don't want to get to that. But the rest of the chain, there are a lot of important things that need to be done and can be done, especially the various vulnerable groups in the chain, including the fish vendors and traders that we talked about, small scale actors in the chain. There are a lot of scope for work. And I would say that the civil society roles could be multiple. I think definitely they have to, whoever works, have to understand, put effort to understand these chains. The FAO food system framework is a good one, it could be used, but really need to understand these chains. Otherwise, we go and meddle in some part of the chain with some good intentions. It may not work out, or it may do more harm sometimes. We need to understand the relative positions and significance of the different actors in the chain, the underlying power relationships. So there has to be an effort to understand and learn before one plunges into action. Obviously, civil society tends to support the underdog who needs support, and one needs to look carefully at that and see the value and importance of that underdog. And then one has to work on that. The importance of entry points are also very important in this. Where you enter the work should be based on your skills and knowledge, and you might have to maximize what you can contribute given your limitations as a CSO. I would say that some of the important areas where some of these stakeholder groups could be strengthened is support for organization. They may be already organized, but they may require further support. Or they are unorganized, they may require organization support. If they will, the stakeholder groups will require information and analysis. Many of them understand their own situation, but their ability to deal with the modern governance systems, the scientific world, and the policymaking sphere is often very weak. So they need information and analysis, and then they need linkages and partnerships. Linkages could be with financial institutions, could be with the government institutions, departments of fisheries, research institutions, and so on, so that these problems that they have can be resolved and solutions can be found. And certainly the CSOs have a good possibility to initiate pilot projects and models and experiment creatively, where others can then learn, and states can then even pick up these ideas for further upscaling. And the CSO sector also can upscale. It's not they cannot upscale, but these are some of the things that the civil society organization can do. I think there is a lot of scope, because the civil society organizations have many, and they have many skills, and they can fit into very different roles, which the government on one hand is slow and not nimble, it will take time, it is formal, and it may not be able to do small things, which are something very important. The communities and the stakeholders are also having their own limitations. They know their situation, they know their problems, but their ability to understand the larger framework in which this has to be analyzed and therefore presented and talked about is also their limitation. So the importance is certainly this link role and the space in between the community and the state is where the civil society has a lot of creative work to do with partnerships, linkages, and work with both sides of the equation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. Now I'd like to turn over to look at the plate end of the food system and looking at consumer behavior and shifting consumer behavior to to involve small fish. I'd like to pose the question first to Marianne and then followed by Akasua, looking at what are the ways forward for consumers and shifting consumer behavior from your perspective as a food scientist.
Yes, I think that's a very important but very difficult question. And of course, having food-based dietary guidelines, that's one step. And also, as Shakuntala mentioned, the first day that this should be nutrition sensitive. And this is not only for those of us that maybe would like to have these for our individual dietary intake, but also that they intend to establish the basis for public food and nutrition and health and agricultural policies, and also make the agenda for nutrition education programs, school feeding programs, and so on. And it's meant to foster healthy eating habits and lifestyle. And there should and are often context specific, taking into account cultural aspects of food. But when it comes to fish, it's not like that all these food guidelines include fish, and also it varies from country to country on if they manage to show the diversity of fish or seafood or aquatic food as a food group. So some may have this included, some may not. And for instance, just to make an example from Norway, we have a more general recommendation, eating 2 to 3 meals of fish weekly, and half of this should be oily fish. But what we see when it comes to the consumer behavior is that very few Norwegians follow this guideline. And you can also see it's very skewed, with women eating less than men, children eating less than grown up, and also that you have a lot of the population not eating fish at all. So how to reach all these groups, I think that's really challenging. And then we had one study that we published last week where we compared Poland and Norway. And what we saw was that the recommendation was more or less the same. And the access to food, food diversity was completely different. It was higher in Poland because Norway have a lot of restrictions. But despite this, Norway had a better nutrient intake than Polish people. So I think what was also mentioned both today and yesterday, that we can have all these good solutions, but how to make changes. And when it comes to research, at least, I think what I have experienced in the Small Fish Food Project is this interdisciplinary work together with social science, which is not so commonly, I think, for natural sciences. And also in the work package I have been leading, mostly containing natural scientists. I've been working very closely with Ragnhild Overå and her group in Ghana. And I think this is at least one step when it comes to the science to make a bigger impact. And when it comes to the consumer behavior, I think this is difficult. But of course, if we have knowledge, then it's easier to make the correct approaches. So I think filling knowledge gaps, we have to continue and make and show data on the aquatic food as a food group, that this is very diverse. And yeah, I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. And yeah, I think that's a good point to ask Akosua to comment. I know your presentation looked at food habits in Ghana and how people are so used to eating kenke with every meal that they say they don't, they haven't eaten if they haven't eaten kenke. And so I don't know if you have some insights on the way forward with consumer behavior and changing consumer perceptions as to what they should be eating and how food-based dietary guidelines can be put into action as well.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to this session. I'm speaking based on my experiences, both my personal experiences as a Ghanaian fish eater, but also based on the work that we did and what I know about our context. And thanks to Martin's earlier point this morning about thinking about policymakers as a range of actors, right? So not just governments. And then think experience and the Ghanaian context. We do eat the small fish. There's a certain concern that over time, as people become more urbanized, more globalized, more higher income earning, they will move away from that. So given that, and given the fact that in Ghana, our fish eating is linked to the carbohydrates. So it's not, you know how like in a Western diet, you go and the menu says the different proteins. So we've got the fish component of the menu, and then you've got the chicken, and then we don't think of our meals in that same way. So I actually think where we should be concentrating effort is on those who have things to do with the eating aspects of policy. So yes, we need a nutritional guide, but from my experience, I'm not sure how many people walk around with that in mind. So you do know you're supposed to eat from the 5 food groups. I'm not sure many people, at least in Ghana, are obsessed with that. So what we need to do is to make that part and parcel of what we do. If we know that fish, small fish is what we are interested in, then what can we do about all of those movements that work on fish and eating habits, right? So I'm thinking in the case of Ghana, which I think is applicable in other parts of the world, to all the different movements around diets and native foods or ethnic foods, and the ways in which we can get the culinary institutes, the ad agencies, those who offer prizes for food, food fairs and those kinds of things, to begin to encourage the inclusion of small fish in diets. So to think of the ways in which menus can be created around the use of the small fish and pair it so that the combination is whatever the meal is can't be had without the small fish. That way, at least in the Ghanaian context, you get people eating the meal because it's new, it's different, this is what the new chefs are providing us, and it incorporates the fish, the small fish, much as we have in our traditional setting, because in the traditional setting, the meals incorporate the fish. So if we are moving away from that and we want to ensure that small fish gets consumed, then we should get those who are in the food movements to make the switch with us, to encourage us to eat these new food items, but those new food items should incorporate the small fish. So the nutritional guidelines are all well and good, but we need to get the different groups, the culinary institutes, the ad agencies who are doing all the TV ads, videos on food, and get them to make small fish, as in Ghana, we say, look hip, right? Look like the 21st century thing to do is to eat small fish, and get all of the different civil society actors that work on the fish eating, consuming part of things to turn it into something that's fashionable, that you want to do, even if you are higher income earning, even if you have options, even if you are urban, globalizing, and so on. That way, then at least from the Ghanaian experience, we've got both the low income and the higher income communities eating the small fish. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point to like consumer perception and making these foods desirable and yeah, hip, as you said, is really important to make sure people are consuming healthy foods as well. I want to turn it over. We had a few questions that came in from the past sessions, and also I think there's been really great questions and comments put into the chat. I wanted to turn this back to some of the questions that have come in for these last 10 or 15 minutes. We had a question from John Curian. He said the markets are both domestic, but did not indicate the nature of the consumers. This was, I think, towards Jory's presentation. Which of the fish value chains or fish chains, local or imported, are more socially, culturally, economically, and ecologically desirable for consumers? I think this goes back to what you were just saying about making small fish desirable for consumers. So looking at which fish chains, local or imported, are more desirable. I don't know if anybody has comments on that. Okay, I'll go to another question then. Let's see here. There's quite a few coming in. Building. Okay. So I think I'll go to another question that came from one of the past sessions. Informal arrangements have been identified as important to enable access by poor consumers. Are there examples of how these informal arrangements can be supported or even restored in the face of increased commercialization of small fish and the food systems to which they contribute? I don't know if Vivek or Maarten has any thoughts on this.
But one of the things here is also the question of what is informal and what is formal. So I think many informal arrangements have some formal connections. They are not necessarily completely informal.
Okay, thank you. Vivek or anyone?
That doesn't really help though, does it? It doesn't really help. How do you, are there examples of assisting informal institutions? Yes, I think there are many examples, and I think what Vivek has also been bringing forward, also in support of, let's say, women's organizations and so on, they are largely, I'm expecting, informal. They are not registered as associations or anything of the sort, but there may be formal elements as well. And maybe Vivek would like to comment on that.
Okay. Yeah, but in many of the areas, we have very strong so-called informal organizations of fishing community groups, various kinds of groups. So in fact, the fishing communities in particular have very strong customary organizations, which would be considered at least by states and outsiders as informal organizations. So there are many such organizations, and they continue to play a very important role in fishery. And where they are recognized and properly integrated in the discussions and interventions, one can definitely expect much better results when they are ignored. And in fact, the states and even NGOs tend to impose artificial organizations on top of communities in the name of organizing them. And they already have very good organizations. So this is something that I would like to highlight, that new mechanisms or new organizations may not often be required. What we need is to ensure that the existing organizations, we first recognize and understand their potential and work with them. So that is probably the most important thing in many situations.
And I see there's also a point brought up about the challenge of implementing policy to reach these ideals and the importance of integrating local knowledge and looking at the importance of women in, for example, Ghanaian fish value chains. I think this links to your point, Vivek, about strengthening organizations, but also looking at incorporating local knowledge and especially women. I don't know if Akasu or if anyone has any comments on that.
I actually wanted to pick up on Vivek's point about ensuring that whatever we do in local communities doesn't just add a layer of bureaucracy without benefits to them. We do have informal organizations, but in many ways they are formal. They have connections with formal organizations. They may not be registered in the sense in which we want written minutes written and all of those kinds of things and having paperwork to back what they do. But there's a lot of order to what gets done in those spaces. So it's important that we keep that in mind so that in seeking to strengthen them, we don't actually undermine their efforts. And I think the earlier point that Maarten also made about how to ensure that in doing all of this, small fish is kept affordable. Because sometimes what all of the interventions mean is that we price it out of the hands of small low-income earners, and then they can't afford the small fish anyway. And yet they are the ones who historically have consumed the small fish. So it's important that we pay attention to whatever interventions we make and ensure that in the end, we don't disenfranchise those for whom small fish has always been something they could have. Thank you.
And Maarten, sorry, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, maybe I can add to this. So first of all, whatever change takes place, change is always a long-term process. It doesn't occur from one day to the next. It occurs over many years. And that's also one reason why many projects are so unsatisfactory. But they have such short time spans that you cannot reach very much. But I agree with Akoswa and with Vivek that it's very important to build on what is already there. And often what is there is also what is sometimes called customary law or customary organizations or something of the sort. And these are frequently legitimate. They are supported by people themselves. And it's a good starting point. And local knowledge is as well. But here there's also another issue that local knowledge, just like many customary organizations, by the way, are not respected in government circles or in scientific circles. There's a tendency to look down on them. And the other way around, there's also a tendency of people who have local knowledge or who are practitioners to also distrust the scientific and the policy and the government side of way of dealing with things. So there's a basic issue of trust and developing trust, and that too is something which requires time. You cannot develop trust overnight. It takes time to build, and well, I think that's one of the challenges we are up against.
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one more question. There was a question also submitted on looking at formalized rules of the community supported fisheries model as a means of improving benefits to fishers while also supporting local food security. And looking at community supported fisheries as maybe a more northern response, or does anybody have lessons in terms of changing the narrative away from technocracy that we've been seeing quite a bit coming up in the discussion?
Maybe just a very short reaction. I think the way this seminar was organized and with the different disciplines involved, the moment you have a broad interdisciplinary collaboration, there's also a good chance that you will avoid particular one-sided ways of approaching matters. So I think the interdisciplinarity itself is an important starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And this food systems approach and food systems framework helps to kind of tie all of these different stakeholders together and different data from different sectors to look at the full systems approach. And as we've seen, make sure that policies or investments in one sector don't inadvertently affect food security or nutrition. Are there any other thoughts on this question? Vivek?
One could even see, because we are looking at even though there's the larger food system framework, at some way the starting point is the fishing, the fish and the fishing. And therefore the integration of many of the things that we are talking into the fisheries management systems are very weak. Fisheries management, which is in the control of departments of fisheries and various authorities, are still based on the completely obsolete Western textbooks, which EPE has also been challenging from another perspective. So the complete system needs revamp at that level, because it's the biggest hurdle. Everybody who comes out of Fishery Science Institute is completely brainwashed and does not understand. And when we really look for solutions for our problems, we were looking at the trawl problem in India, and there was a very good meeting Martin and some of us organized and got even some good Western scientists to talk to us about decommissioning trawlers. They said that the fisheries management in the West looks at only from an efficiency point of view. There is no social content in it. And that is in those countries taking place through a very difficult political process. And it is missing in the text. And therefore the fisheries management is so apolitical that it is so bad. It is completely ignoring genuine needs of these countries, and the science that they study has no solution for this. So I think that is one of the starting points, that the fisheries management for the tropics and for developing countries needs to be developed as an interdisciplinary thing, rather than dominated by biologists on the one hand and maybe some economists on the other. It's completely, the other social content is so weak.
I totally agree, Vivek. The problem with us fisheries scientists, and I'm one of them myself, is that we only think about some biology, and it's very basic biology, and then economy. We have nobody's ever taught us anything about nutrition or social needs or anything like that. I mean, the whole thing changed with Christophe Benet when he introduced the wealth-based approach instead of the welfare approach instead of the wealth-based approach. So there's a need for a change of the paradigm.
Yeah. Thank you. These are really good points. And this takes us back to what was brought up in the beginning of the seminar yesterday on how we value fish and what fish we value or what foods we value. So I think this is a point that we can take into further discussions. And this whole session was really just a starting point, I think, rather than an end. It's a starting point for further discussion and taking us into this technical paper that Maarten has mentioned a couple of times. And yeah, I hope it was only 1 hour, but there's so many different pieces to pull together, and this discussion and all of these sessions have been very rich. So I thank all of the panelists and the organizers as well for organizing this conference, and I'll turn it over to Maarten, I believe, to close us out.
Okay, thanks, Molly. Thank you for also leading this session. Okay, what can we say? Well, this is the end of a 2-day meeting on a very specific but also very relevant topic, the role of small, low-cost fish for food and nutrition security of poor people. I think that's, if you talk about food security and nutrition security, we are concerned about the poor. And that's, I think, what we've been talking about these 2 days. I like the way Molly ended, also saying that this is, in a sense, we are closing this seminar, but it is also a starting point, I think, for new initiatives and new things, such as, and that's, I've mentioned this before, the technical paper that we are hoping to realize on the topic. But there may be other plans as well. There will be new research projects, there will be new initiatives, and I think it depends on all of us to move things forward. Maybe just one last thing. As you have noticed, our deliberations over these 2 days have been recorded, and this recording will also be made available to participants. So you can expect at some point, you can expect an email telling you where this recording can be found and how you can make use of it. So I think that's basically it. It's been tiring, I think. Watching Zoom for so many hours, 2 days in a row is quite intense. But I think we've gotten a lot of interesting work done, and we've heard a lot of very interesting ideas and research findings and so on. And I'm sure we are all, also spirited or again motivated to continue this interesting and important work. So thanks all of you. Thanks first of all to the moderators who have really done a good job. Thanks for the presenters, people who were on the panels. Thanks to the backstage people, Sharon and Nick, who have done a wonderful job in keeping all of us online somehow. And thanks then lastly for the participants, for all of you who have joined. And we look forward to collaborating further with you. So please communicate with us if there's a good reason to do so. And have a very nice day, evening, night, whatever the time zone in your particular country may be. So see you again and all the best.